Okay, we had a great setup session the last session, so we are going to continue our daring and brave activities in our mini conference. So I know many of you have had encounters with our keynote speaker, either as a person or perhaps through her reading or her work, Irma McClaurin, but I call her the quintessential Zorophile. Let me just put it out there, the quintessential Zorophile. And we knew we could not continue or conclude our mini conference or our Hurston Institute, Hurston on the Horizon Institute, without involving her so that all of us could have an encounter with the one and only. I don't want to take away from your time, but I do want to give you a brief introduction to those who may not know you. Irma McClaurin has had a star-studded career. We're talking earlier about what it means to choose an academic or professional career and the challenges when one carves out one's own path. And this is exactly what she has done. I cannot think of anyone who has done that as successfully as you have in multiple areas: arts, higher education, the corporate sector. When I came to know her first, she was a published poet. More about that later. But Irma pursued a degree in anthropology as one of the few Black women who has played a leading role in shaping and redefining the field. One might say that she began as a traditional academic. Following her graduate education, she published her first academic book. It's been mentioned earlier, I think, Linden, Women of Belize, and rose through the professional ranks at the University of Florida, with affiliations in anthropology, women's studies, the Center for Latin American Studies and African Studies. While there, she was also the director of the Zora Neale Hurston Diaspora Studies Research Group. Among her many accomplishments, one must include the groundbreaking Black feminist anthropology, theory, politics, praxis, and poetics. And she has continued to publish a wide array of works for a range of audiences. What stands out for me is that she is an interdisciplinary scholar, we've been talking about that, who has not only talked the talk, but walked the walk. A 2019 publication, for example, is another groundbreaking work, Black Studies and Interdisciplinary, Black Studies, an interdisciplinary, integrative, and interactive approach, co-authored with Marilyn Thomas Houston, another anthropologist we know in the Hurston tradition. With such unique skills, abilities, training, and most of all, energy, it is not surprising that Irma's career has been so impact-driven. Her time as a program officer at the Ford Foundation, the chief diversity officer at Teach for America, and as a college president has given her a perspective on higher education that has been invaluable to so many people, and I include myself in that number. This knowledge she continues to share in her hundreds of consultations and presentations. I am certain that today we extend that network of her beneficiaries as she takes the covers off and digs into the complexity of Zora as a woman who both inspires and challenges us, just as she does for those who have followed her lead. If Marla Jackson, we'll have to show you that video, is the soul of Zora, then Irma McClaurin is the heart. On a more personal note, her appearance today brings our relationship full circle. We first met years ago at our first NEH Institute. It was the beginning of many encounters, since at that time, some of you know, NEH was not for students, not for undergrad or grad students. So we were basically illegal. And so we were roommates so that we could band together and fight anybody who resisted our being there. But if what goes around comes around, I believe we are on a journey, y'all, and it ain't over yet. Irma McClaurin has been on that journey a long time. Please join me in welcoming her today as our keynote speaker for Hurston on the Horizon, our mini conference. Thank you. Irma.
Thank you so much for that introduction. And I'll start by saying I'm Irma McClaurin. I am a brown-skinned Black woman with gray twists that come down to my shoulder. And I am channeling Zora by wearing a rust-colored floppy hat, and I'm wearing a green top, chartreuse, I guess is the color. And like Zora, I didn't want to come on before because I wanted to make an appearance.
Yes.
So I want to start with a definition of what it means to channel. Channeling Zora Neale Hurston, why she speaks to me as a creative and anthropologist. Channeling involves, this is the definition, consciously shifting your mind and mental space in order to achieve an expanded state of consciousness. They may imagine themselves seeking out specific spirits of the dead, or they may be contacted, apparently unbidden, by some unknown force that wishes to communicate. I am locating my channeling of Zora Neale Hurston in that part of the above definition that speaks of consciously shifting your mind and mental space and imagining myself seeking out the specific spirit of the dead, and that is Zora Neale Hurston. My seeking Zora Neale Hurston has occurred over a long period of time. I've been living with her both as a literary person and later as an anthropologist, her spirit for several decades. You see, I first encountered Zora in my literary life, and I will use the familiar first name with her not as out of disrespect, but to signify our long-term spiritual relationship. I cannot recall in which course I first made Zora's literary acquaintance. Michael Thelwell's course on the power of Nomo, or Bernard Bell's course on Afro-American literature. The year was 1973, and the W.E.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies at the University of Massachusetts Amherst, UMass Amherst, had only been in existence since 1971. Professor Thelwell was in Afro-American Studies, while Professor Bell was one of 2 of 3 Black professors in the English department. The other 2 were the late Joe Scarrett and the late Chinua Achebe. I had the pleasure of knowing Joe on a social level. He loved to cook and garden, 2 passions we shared. And I got to know Chinua Achebe by taking his course on African literature and later working with him as his first research assistant on his magazine, Okiki. Outside of the English department, Michael Thelwell taught African-American literature, as well as Eugene Terry. Rest assured, in 1973, I had never heard of Zora Neale Hurston, nor was she on the list of must-reads in any of the courses in white American literature that I was consigned to complete as part of my enrollment in the Masters of Fine Arts in English program at UMass, with a specialization in poetry. All the professors in the MFA department were white. All the courses in the English department were taught by white faculty, with the exception of those created by the ones I named previously. Dr. Esther Terry in Afro-American Studies was the only Black woman on campus teaching Black literature and dramaturgy. And Dr. Janetta Cole was in African-American Studies teaching anthropology and later moved into anthropology. What had attracted me to this seemingly white outpost that was a year prior to my arrival? In 1972, they had hired the first Black chancellor in the Massachusetts State University system, Dr. William Randolph Bromley. He was also only the 2nd Black person in the country to hold a position of chancellor at a predominantly white institution. My journey was not unlike Chancellor Bromley's. In 1973 at the UMass Amherst, I was one of 3 Black students in the MFA program in English. There were no such concepts as people of color, didn't exist, it wasn't a thing. And those who now lay claim to being POCs because of touch of melanin in their skin chose to walk with whiteness back then. They wanted nothing to do with Blackness. So almost half a decade ago, anti-Blackness was rampant, even among those who call themselves today people of color. What would Zora think of such designation? Does calling ourselves people of color instead of African Americans or Black erase the cultural heritage that Zora so desperately worked to document and preserve? White women were also scarce in the MFA department. There were none, 0, teaching in the program as permanent faculty, though there were some in English. In the elite MFA program, women were only good enough to be brought in for a semester or two as visiting faculty. My brief exposure to white women were writers like Civ Fox and Maxine Kumin, both poets, came through this drop-in process. That moment, the early 1970s, was truthfully one in which all the regular professors were white and majority men. Women's studies had not been born, and Afro-American studies was in its infancy. This poem represents my experience. It's called Chains. Across the far end of this town, ghosts walk among the provincial folk. Emily Dickinson suckles poems behind gravestones, and Frost, Robert Frost, lives in a library in Amherst, a place of hidden passages. Death lingers like new dough, and nobody knows my name. Here I cannot remember my mother's mother. Who was that Black woman pointing to me at Emily's grave? Her black finger, crooked and mournful, beckoned me as I sat at the temple of white rooms, lace and tea, where Emily chose to die a slave to solitude. She shook her head, and slaves moaned in their cabins, brushed against butterfly voices in the wind. In this lilac country, bees parade around bushes in August finery. I stumble across streets, chained to a vision of my lost Black muse. I imagine that this is the same predicament in which Zora must have found herself, swimming against a tide of whiteness as she navigated the white space of Barnard College to become its first Black graduate. Imagine so much of herself that she had to hide: her age, her lack of formal schooling, to prepare her for a collegiate education. Could she be her authentic self? Probably not. But outside of Barnard, Zora was rich in literary company. She was with those whom later scholars would designate as members of what we now call the Harlem Renaissance. She hung out with Langston Hughes, Countee Cullen, Wallace Thurman, and got to know W.B. Du Bois and Elaine Locke, the latter whom she disliked, and many more. We know little about Zora's relationship with the women of the Harlem Renaissance. First, the Black male authorities writing about the HR have made the history Black male-centric. Perhaps the success of the film Passing will encourage more attention to be paid to the women of the Harlem Renaissance creatives like Nella Larson. Zora, however, has her due now in the literary canon. But let us not forget, it was not always so. This fame and acclaim of Zora, what would she think of having an entire institute, Zora on the Horizon, named after her? This recognition of Zora as a critical literary figure is a come lately. Lest we forget, Zora died penniless in a poorhouse in Fort Pierce, Florida. Lest we forget, it was a young, curious, not too well-known writer, Alice Walker, who delivered Zora from literary obscurity when she published the seminal essay, Looking for Zora, in Ms. Magazine in 1973. What sparked Walker's interest began in her journey as a student when she asked herself of the materials she was reading, where are the Black collectors of folklore? Where's the Black anthropologist? Where's the Black person who took the time to travel the back roads of the South and collect the information I need? I remember reading this essay. Thus, my first encounter with Zora was literary. Around 1975, I began to develop a course on Black women in literature. I taught Alice Walker, Toni Morrison, Toni Cade Bambara, Zora Neale Hurston, Sonia Sanchez, who was my teacher at Amherst College, Toni Morrison. In my literary creative life, Mules and Men and Their Eyes Were Watching God were the two seminal texts that students could read, reread, and they became the evidence of Zora's literary greatness. I recall reading aloud passages from Mules and Men on a road trip to South Carolina, Along the way, I swear we encountered people straight out of Zora's writing. Her sensibility for Black folk culture and language were so authentic. For example, we stopped in Tuscaloosa, Alabama to ask directions for lodging. The two old men laughed and looked at each other. The conversation could have been from those sitting on the porch at Joe's store. Well, you could go to the motel up the street, but the bed bugs there wear headlights. They suggested we try the college. Needless to say, we kept driving until we reached Tuskegee and stayed in a dormitory. Zora's world of Black folk culture didn't end there. While it is true we saw no bed bugs with headlights, we did encounter the morning cleaning staff who started early, cleaning and talking very loudly. By the time we left for breakfast, we had heard and knew everybody's business. Zora's plays and short stories were also available around which a strong literary corpus could be built. Without a doubt, Zora's proclivity in literature is evidenced by the numerous outpourings about her life and her work as a literary figure. These include Robert Hemingway's original biography in 1977, followed by Valerie Boyd's biography, Wrapped in Rainbow, in 2003. Other works about Zora include Zora Neale Hurston and American Literary Culture, 2005, Zora in Florida, 1991, and Zora Neale Hurston, Final Decade, 2011, and that's not all of it. Of course, we mustn't forget Lucy Hurston, Zora's niece contribution. The pop-up toy book biography, Speak So You Can Speak Again, The Life of Zora Neale Hurston, takes us on a magical journey through Zora's life. It is an interactive book that contains facsimiles of historical papers, handwritten notes, photographs, greeting cards made by Zora, as well as charred draft notes for her novel, Seraph on the Swanee. Through this book, we see the evidence of Zora as a creative, one who drew Christmas cards for her friends and wrote letters that read like a magical travel log of her research. For me, the most significance of this correspondence archived at the Yale Beinecke Library is the communications between Zora and Langston Hughes. What survived are the letters Zora sent to Langston, which he kept, despite their parting of company over the infamous creative collaboration Mulebone, and ask me about what I think about that. I describe what this correspondence reveals in an article called Bell Letters, Dear Langston Loves Zora, published in Flavor magazine in autumn 2000. This was a Black lifestyle magazine created to document the world of Florida's creatives and professional people, among which Zora is the most celebrated. This correspondence between Zora and Langston inspired me, for they revealed more than previously known about Zora's process as an anthropologist. And I went there looking for her journals, and they just don't exist. There's one in the Smithsonian about her last novel that she was working on. But other than that, Zora was someone who often had to put her work in storage, her materials, and then didn't have the money to get them out. And I think given her notoriety and visibility by now, if they existed, somebody would have come forward with them. So the letters become very critical. This is what I wrote in that Bell Letters. Quote, the letters to Langston Hughes were written during a 3-year period, 1927 to 1930, and sent bi-weekly. Now you think about that. There was no priority mail. There was no first class mail that got there in 3 days. This is 1927, okay? They always began, Dear Langston, and ended with the salutation, Love Zora, or Lovingly Zora. They were filled with descriptions of her field work in the workers' camps, and she went to citrus camps and turpentine camps, where she found much of her folk material, stories, songs, dances. Zora confided in Langston about her book ideas and revealed her vision of a time when they would collaborate and bring the Black folk culture she found in her own Florida backyard of Maitland, Eatonville, and Jacksonville, and in places like Magazine, Alabama, to the stage and the public's attention. Zora was to make the documentation and legitimization of Black folk culture the foci focal point of her life. In these letters to Langston, Zora tested out her ideas and theories about the form, function, and meaning of Black folklore she collected. To her, the stories, the songs, and the dances were creative outpourings that flourished under the most abject conditions in the backwoods of Florida, Alabama, and Mississippi. And just to say a word, the citrus camps and turpentine camps were not sharecropping on the land, but they were very close to being indentured servitude. They were very harsh conditions, and it was work that actually we now know would have health implications for people down the road. Langston in turn helped Zora refine her thoughts. He provided questions and suggestions about the direction her work should take. And we don't have his letters to her, but the way that she responded, you would know that that was in those letters. So this is what Zora wrote. Without flattery, Langston, you are the brains of this argosy. All the ideas have come out of your head. I have enough for a good volume of stories, but I shall miss nothing. I shall go to New Orleans from here. Oh, almost forgot. Found another one of the original Africans, older than Cujo, about 200 miles upstate on the Tombigbee River. She is most delightful, but no one will ever know about her but us. In this same letter dated July 10, 1928, sent from Magazine, Alabama, we see the evidence of Hurston, the anthropologist. What I discovered in my research was that Hurston's field notes were embedded in her correspondence, especially in her letters to Langston Hughes. Indeed, she writes to Langston of her linguistic discoveries, quote, I am learning better technique, getting more love letters too, and she was collecting love letters, don't know what happened to those, and keeping close tabs on expressions of double meaning too, also compiling a list of double words. They, the people she was researching, to give emphasis, use the noun and then put the function of the noun before it as an adjective. Example, sitting chair. You thought that was part of American linguistic culture. It comes from Black vernacular. Suck bottle, cook pot, hair comb. These were creations that she was discovering, that Black folks were creating linguistic creativity. Zora would use this cultural material she collected as the basis of theoretical reflections about Black culture and linguistic expression in essays that were published in Nancy Cunard's Negro and Anthology. Interestingly, that she chose a book aimed at the public and not a scholarly one. And I felt like very strongly that when I was writing about her, that I needed to not put it in an academic journal. The essays there are 3 of them, although one has multiple sections. The characteristic of Negro expression, spiritual and Negro spirituals, the genuine meets the artistic and Black sacred music, and folklore and music. And the characteristics of Negro expression has about 7 sections in it. So it's a fairly long essay. So there's no dearth of literary acclaim for Zora. Indeed, I just saw another book edited by Henry Louis Gates, You Don't Know Us Negroes and Other Stories, that was just released on January 18th, 2022. So the books just keep coming. So how about talking about doing anthropology and ethnography the Zora Neale Hurston way? And I wish to strongly suggest that when literary scholars, when you gloss over Zora's training as an anthropologist, you miss how her ethnographic practices and fieldwork are embedded in her literary creativity, and also how her stylistic literary conventions inform the way that she wrote ethnography. Indeed, well before anthropologists began to view ethnography as genre, Zora was already creating a style of autoethnographic writing, an ethnographic methodology of native anthropology that challenged the conventions of her time. Black anthropologist Gwendolyn Mickle, in her chapter, Feminism and Black Culture in the Ethnography of Zora Neale Hurston, which appears in the groundbreaking African-American Pioneers in Anthropology, edited by Ira E. Harrison and Faye B. Harrison, no relation, asserts that Zora has been ignored because, quote, she selected a framework that was contextual, literal, creatively symbolic, and participatory, what Roland Bush calls ethnographic subjectivity. So let me explain that ethnography is the name that we give to the method used for the holistic study of life it is lived and experienced. So what we do is ethnography. That is our methodology. And also the term is used to describe what we produce is also called ethnography. Trained by Franz Boas, considered the father of American anthropology, Zora, like his other students, Margaret Mead and Kroeber, believed in the immersive, and also Herskovits, believed in the immersive fieldwork in order to understand the culture from the point of view, what we call the emic perspective of the insider. An important aspect of ethnographic practice then is to participate and to learn to view the culture from the insider's point of view, which while maintaining objectivity. Ethnographic subjectivity challenged the notions that anthropologists can in fact remain objective, since their very presence influences what people say and do. And they are also themselves, the anthropologists, changed by the experience. As McHale suggests, quote, in insisting that one give authentic presentation of reality, Zora approached a methodology that later scholars would call emic, insider's ethnography, and quote, reflexivity, as she, Zora, became the instrument for recording and playing back the oral and visionary text of Black culture. She adapted what would later be called interpretive and symbolic styles. And she refused to translate Black culture for the benefit of white audiences, of outsiders. So how do these ideas that Zora had about anthropology and the practice of ethnography inform her literary work is evident in her subject matter, much of which was derived directly from her research. If you look at her plays, they're really just taken out of her field notes and put into a stage format. But the dialogue, the descriptions of what people are doing, all of that is being informed by her actual research. But also in applying her ethnographic stance of refusing to translate back culture, we can see that in what happened with Barracoon. Not only is the material in this work taken directly from her interviews with Cujo, whom she talks about in her correspondence with Langston Hughes, but the fact that this work remained unpublished is because Zora refused to translate the dialect. And that's evident, that gives us evidence of how strongly she felt about this authentic representation. Deborah Platt, who edited Barracoon, writes, quote, Hurston's manuscript is an invaluable historical document. As Savani Diouf, who discovered it, an extraordinary literary achievement, and I would add informed by her ethnographic research as well, despite the fact that it found no takers during her time. No publisher would publish it. They actually said, if you make it into standard English, we'll take it. And she said no. So it's laid there for what, 100 years now almost. In it, Zora found a way to produce a written text that maintains the orality of the spoken word. And she did so without imposing herself in the narrative, creating what some scholars classify as orature, end quote. So Zora was not just committed to collecting the artifacts of African-American culture, she was adamant about the authentic presentation. And even as she rejected what was the objective observer stance, and this is what anthropologists talk about, go in and participate, but be objective, stand back. And the way that ethnography was written at that moment is really this notion of the omniscient narrator. You know, it's like anthropologists look down on the people and they can see everything, but they're not in it, right? Even as she rejected this, which many modern anthropologists began to abandon in the 1980s and forward with the rise of what we now call dialogic methodology, autoethnography, cultural critique, feminist anthropology, Afro-American anthropology, and Black feminist anthropology. She still incorporated standard features of ethnographic and folk folklore collecting processes within her methodology. So what we see in Barracone are those aspects of ethnography and folklore collecting that reveal Hurston's methodology and the authenticated Hosolo's story as his own, rather than as a fiction of her imagination. Plant makes a significant case for why literary scholars have to pay greater attention to Zora the anthropologist. Much of the content for her novels, her short stories, her plays are derived from this ethnographic fieldwork. They are not fictions of Zora's imagination, as Plant so articulates so well. So for me, it's this confluence of both the literary and the anthropological, ethnographic that enables me to channel Zora as someone whose own work is filled with border crossings in which the literary and the ethnographic converge. Here's what Michael Stone, who published the first digital review, had to say about my ethnography, Women of Beliefs, Gender and Change in Central America. It was the second book ever published on women in Belize, formerly the British Honduras, and the first to let them speak for themselves, retaining their Creole language. Quote, the work comprises an eclectic blend of interviews, field notes, transcriptions, ethnographic reflections, a survey of NGO and official reports on women's status in Belize and the region, an interrogation of Belizean fiction and the author's own poetry. This is a reflexive, deeply personal, and politically engaged ethnography. As such, it joins a long tradition of first-person narrative, especially by female anthropologists, written against the grain in a critique of the norms of positivist social science. In this era of postmodern scholarship, the researcher's self-positioning is obligatory, and McClaurin states her political position unapologetically. And he quotes me, in this work, I say, I do not pretend to be detached. I owe no allegiance to scientific objectivity. Instead, I insist that in any fieldwork experience, we are always involved, despite any posturing we may do to the contrary. He goes on to say, my experimental approach asserts, as most anthropologists and historians agree, that the boundaries between ethnography, fiction, and personal narrative are often difficult to perceive. As Kamala Vissawaran notes, anthropologists as diverse as Sapir, Kroeber, Malinowski, Boas, Benedict, Zora Neale Hurston, and Elsie Clues-Parson all experimented with narrative and fictional modes, establishing a little-noted tradition that persists into the present, end quote. I would go somewhat further than Stone and assert that Zora was an ethnographic innovator, anticipating conventions that we now take for granted. Back in Zora's time, McHale reminds us that, quote, public enthusiasm for Hurston's research was countered by scholarly ambivalence. Although her Barnard and Columbia colleagues had at first valued her folklore research and sought her out to use her contacts in the Black community of Florida and New Orleans. Does that sound familiar? If it sounds familiar, raise your hands. Yeah, okay. As they pursued their own research, and I have stories of graduate students saying to me at the University of Florida that they were asked when they wanted to study the Black community, they were told, well, that's really not good for you, but if you do the research, then I'll write about it. So, and that wasn't so far long ago. They were either ambivalent about Zora's work or hostile to her methodology and research techniques, or scandalized by the depth of her participation in cultural practices, end quote. She goes on to say that in Tell My Horse, Hurston was alternatively accused of journalistic approaches or entering too fully into the cultural experiences of her informants, end quote. Now, isn't it ironic that we now have this big push for what we call public scholarship, right? In which people are writing op-eds and columns and, you know, all kinds of things. But at that point, they were scandalized and she was being accused, persecuted because of the way in which she wrote about her research. Also, Zora faced resistance from scholars like Melville Herskovitz, who wrote The Myth of the Negro Past, and of whom McHale says in a footnote, quote, he was skeptical about whether Black Americans could be objective enough to conduct field research in African and Caribbean areas. While Herskovits did have 1 or 2 Black researchers, he opposed funding autonomous projects for Blacks in African-based cultures, and he often refused to train them as graduate students, end quote. These circumstances are still present today in a field that is described as public white space. Also, an anthropologist who has studied the Herskovits archives brought to my attention that what he found was correspondence in which Herskovits often pitted Zora Neale Hurston and Catherine Dunham against each other deliberately. And I'm certain anthropology is not the only discipline in which this occurs. How many of you know? I see some head shaking, yes. So what is this? What is that phrase in Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, to whom it may concern, keep this end boy running? That was what was happening to Zora. And what I want to do is to offer 10 reasons why I think Zora Neale Hurston has to be included in the canons of mainstream anthropology and feminist anthropology, and why, as literary scholars, you have to pay greater attention to the ways in which anthropology and ethnographic practices have influenced her literary work. But before I talk about that, I want to pause and acknowledge that there is a scholar named John Whitson. He's written a critique called, quote, "What is Zora Neale Hurston's Barracoon? The Failure of Scholarship in the Presence of Modernist Esoteric," end quote. And in it, he asserts, quote, "None of Hurston's anthropological texts are actually anthropology. What happens in her most influential anthropology text, Mules and Men, is nothing short of flagrant hilarity. Hurston mocks the reader at every turn. What it says about those scholars who have been able to take this text seriously as anthropology is astoundingly compromising, damaging, and convicting. In effect, there is no extant scholarship that addresses Hurston competently." Of course, his. Indeed, Whitson goes on to argue that, quote, "Insofar as Hurston is concerned, her writings cannot be understood apart from her relationship with A.R. Orage and the school of esotericism and its impact on, quote, the construction of the modernist school of literature in the UK and the USA. And he has written numerous essays inserting that Hurston's work is steeped in coded messages that relate to, quote, traditional Kabbalah, that esoteric doctrine of mysterious art used by alchemists in Europe for 1,000 years, that he says her work is really a phonetic code. I present this idea, his critique, not for the purposes of responding or debating, but to acknowledge that alternative opinions and interpretations about Zora as an anthropologist exist. Be that as it may, I prefer to embrace her within the discipline, and I'm no longer alone in this, as an anthropologist, folklorist, and ethnographer. Can all of us be wrong? So 10 reasons why Zora Neale Hurston should be lifted from the shadows of anthropology. 1, native anthropology. Hurston positioned herself early on as a, quote, native anthropologist, though not without some ambivalence, as Hemingway suggests in his biography, in which she articulates the politics and ethics of studying her own people, privileging emic insider's perspective, positioning herself as part of the cultural landscape, and dictating an ethical commitment to be truthful and transparent. 2, writing culture or ethnography as genre. Decades before James Clifford and George Marcus published their edited book, Writing Culture, The Poetics and Politics of Ethnography in 1986, Zora was writing culture. Her ethnographies and novels were experimental and stood outside the academic norms of writing, as well as the literary conventions of protest literature carved out for the Black writers of her time. She laid the foundation for us to imagine ethnography as a genre. 3, autoethnographic voice and reflexivity. Zora invoked the personal, the subjective, alongside the ethnographic well before reflexivity entered into the anthropology lexicon. And her analysis in a constructivist paradigm that people, 1, construct their own understanding and knowledge of the world through experiencing things and reflecting on those experiences. And that's what she was trying to capture. 4, public anthropology. Hurston published across multiple disciplines and platforms to reach the public. Academic, folklore journals, novels, she produced plays, and like Margaret Mead, she also wrote for newspapers and magazines. She predates Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, but made every effort to communicate broadly about the human condition of Black folk, and she understood the risk. She wrote to Langston, April 30th, 1929, quote, "I have to rewrite a lot, as you can understand, for I not only want to present the material with the life and color of my people, I want to leave no loopholes for the scientific crowd to rend and tear us," end quote. Like Black anthropologists today, and I would venture Black literary scholars and literary scholars of color, Hurston operated within the veil of double consciousness and walked the fine line of writing for the scientific community and writing for and about her people. 5, engaged anthropology. Hurston's work reflects a deep commitment to gaining social recognition, e.g. social justice, for her people and demonstrating the beauty and value of Negro Black culture. 6, womanism, Black feminism. Hurston was forging a womanist Black feminist ethnographic tradition in Tell My Horse and echoed in Their Eyes Were Watching God well before the invention of feminism, although suffrages had been happening at that moment. And Black women were involved in the suffragist movement, contrary to what is often presented to us. Many of us Black anthropologists continue to follow the tail of this ethnographic comet called Zora. Says Wall, in quote, in an article, says Cheryl Wall in an article, quote, "In Jamaica, Hurston was directly confronted with her own femaleness and the restrictions that men placed on women intellectuals because of their gender. It angered her to discover that Black women were excluded from vast areas of culture because of their gender." 7, radical humanism. Hurston's ethnographies and literary works reflect a radical humanistic cultural perspective rooted in African-American epistemologies and a worldview forged under the harshest and most oppressive of conditions that produced folk traditions, creativity, humor, and culturally rich language and performances. And at one point, she actually writes to Langston, and she didn't like to talk about herself in the field. So what she would do is actually read his poetry and then have people see how people responded. And then she'd give them feedback. They liked this poem, and they would like listen to the poem, and then they'd pick up the guitar, and then they'd start riffing off the poem, improvising. And she would say they liked this poem, but they didn't like that one. And she would send him this feedback. A radical Black feminist, number 8, as noted earlier, Hurston was continuously, quote, speaking her mind in the midst of Black and white patriarchal environments and having to deal with the consequences. She fought for what she believed in Negro Black culture. And she once stated, quote, "I am not being trained to do a routine job. I'm being trained to do what has not been done and that which cries out to be done. My ground is practically untouched. Boaz is very eager for the American Negro field to be done that includes the islands." And that's why I call her progenitor of Black studies, because what she had in mind would have predated the formality. It would have been a PhD in Negro studies. 9, reflexive anthropology. Hurston was well aware of her own place in the field and how she impacted the research, which is the foundation of reflexive anthropology, defined as, quote, "the researcher's awareness of an analytical focus on his or her relationship to the field," end quote. And number 10, decolonizing anthropology. Hurston's gift to anthropology in general, and specifically Black anthropologists, are numerous and rooted in decolonizing anthropology. We owe her for the ethnographic rigor, the reflexivity, the fieldwork principles in autoethnographic and ethnographic writing, her creative approaches to data collection, and of her intellectual vision of Black, aka Negro culture, as a viable intellectual field of study. For efforts to interrogate and document Black culture, I dub her, quote, the progenitor of Black studies. Hurston's life and scholarship and testimony on how to remain productive under the harshest of conditions also are lessons for us. And those conditions for her included financial insecurity, racialized ideologies, political beliefs at odds with her peer, working against the grain of her discipline, and gender bias. So let me conclude. I follow in Zora's footsteps. I once wrote, I count myself among that generation of Black anthropologists and writers strongly influenced by Zora's example. I cannot say that I followed her path consciously, nor can I say for sure whether it was Zora who took me to Florida to teach at the University of Florida, or whether it was the warm weather and the fact that azaleas bloom madly in the spring and the Spanish moss drips off the oak trees, lending a delicate beauty to the Florida landscape. I miss it. I can only say that now, having read Zora's letters to Langston, having perused her handwritten and typed manuscripts, her spirit walks with me. Thank you. Questions? We have time.
Yes. Irma, do you want to get some water or something?
Yes, I have something right here.
Okay, I was thinking about that because I know you need to get a little bit of liquid. While we gather some questions, I have one that I want to start with, but I will let other people, let me watch the chat to see if we have anything. Oh, wow, I have to go down so far. Okay. Okay. Okay, good. So I do want to get you your comments on Langston and Zora. I'll start with that one. You sort of begged us to ask it, and I've been trying to ask you that for a while. So I'll start with that one.
Well, what has been presented in the literature, and I had this conversation with Du Bois's biographer, okay, David Levering Lewis, and I said, you all didn't really like Zora, and he agreed. And so she's been sort of cast as the trigger, but if you read the letters, it was Zora's content that was the catalyst, the core of Mule Bones. You know, she's sending this to Langston, and so they began this collaboration. What happened was that Godmother intervened and sent Louise, I want to say I think it's Louise Johnson, I can't remember her name, but she came in. So imagine if you're working with a partner and you all have started this project, you're collaborating, you're writing, and now you get a third person that comes in, and someone who's not just there, she's supposed to be a typist, but who is very, Louise Thompson, who's very, she's a very dynamic person. I've met her daughter, and she's published letters between her parents and Langston. And I said, so what about Zora? And she said, that's a private conversation. So I don't know the full scoop, but I think what happened is that they had a chemistry, and this person coming in sort of threw it off. And so for Zora, it became like a thing. And when they parted, she started wanting to do stuff on her own. He was challenging her. And I did read in letters, some Langston letters in the Spingarn, that he regretted that their egos were such that they could never actually apologize. But the nature of their relationship to me was such that when Zora was misaccused of improper relations or, behavior with a child, and she was going to be called, the only character witness, and everybody else had tossed her to the side, the only character witness she listed was Langston Hughes. And that was going to be, had it gone to court, it was actually dismissed, but had it gone to court, she trusted him with her life. That was going to be her life. So to me, I think the dynamics of Mule Bone has been misrepresented and misunderstood. And if you look at the level of correspondence between the two, I mean, bi-weekly, this woman was writing him, and, you know, I'm assuming he was responding. You know, they had this great chemistry going on, and I think it just got disrupted. And two of them were such that they couldn't bring it together, you know, in that sense.
Okay, questions? I don't see where anybody's posted. I think we were so captivated by your presentation, we didn't have time to chat.
You mean I channeled her okay?
So if you have a question, please, okay. Yep, we got lots of hearts showing. People are showing a lot of love here. Okay, Candace, you have a question? Are your hands up from a question?
Sorry, the mute, I couldn't get it. I just wanted to say first, thank you so much, Doctor. I wanted to ask you, it was very highly inspiring that you did it so intentionally also weave in and center the relationship and the sort of soulmate, intellectual soul exchange of two people who were largely excluded from mainstream and all these other institutions of support as they forged their creativity and envisioned. And I just wanted to know, have there been any, not to, you know, ask you about specifics, but was that another feature of the way that you have shaped your work? Have you worked in tandem with another sort of intellectual soulmate who questioned you, or do you see that same relationship in the course of your own journey?
I do. I've had it with a couple of people. One you have to understand is that graduate studies in both literature and in the social sciences, we are conditioned to be individualistic. And so we're trained to sort of focus on us and not to share. And so when I actually had, when I used to teach graduate studies, I would always have a project where people had to collaborate. The undergraduates got it. The graduate students, I'd have to drag them, and these are Black graduates, kicking and screaming. They didn't want to share. They thought someone was going to take their ideas. So I can say that Francois Twine, who is trained as an anthropologist, but actually teaches in sociology and is tenured. She's written over 70 articles. She's extremely prolific, multiple books, Windance, 2Ds, Twine. She and I actually put together the panel that was to become the book. And her name is not on it because at the time she was working on other projects. But we had brainstormed, we had agreed with the book. And when I had to do the introduction, which was I did a lot of editing of everyone's chapter, pushing Black women anthropologists who had great ideas, but had been trained to write in a very academic way. And so I had to really push them to write autoethnographically. And most of the people took the papers that they'd done at the panel and threw them out and literally started over again. One person, the late Angela Gilliam, she said, I've always wanted to do a travel log. So her chapter in that book is like a travel log where she goes to Papua New Guinea, she does research, she goes someplace else, and then she's in Brazil, right? So people were really grappling with how do they get the way in which they write to reflect where their mind, where their headset is, you know, where their mind is and where their heart is, right? So Francois Twine is someone I've collaborated with. And then my ace boon is Dr. Cashel Scott. She's a sociologist at Grinnell, and literally she comes and spends like weeks at a time with me, and we just write and brainstorm. You know, and I know that a lot of, there's a group called the Ludi Lido Conference for law professors. They actually get together and they have at least 3 to 4 days before the conference where they all sit in a room working on their project, but feeling that sense of like, they're not alone in this venture. So yes, I've been very fortunate to have that sounding board. I mean, Keisha and I talk almost every day. My colleague, Dr. George Priestley, who passed away, we would talk every day, bounce ideas off, brainstorm. So I've been fortunate to have that. And I try and share that now.
Anybody else? I don't see any hands.
Come on,
I did
ask me
want to
a
ask.
question about being a creative or something.
I do want to ask a question, and thank you so much, Dr. McClaurin. And since you offer by asking about being a creative, I'm going to ask you about that. But I wanted to ask you first if it's a purely selfish question, because I've been thinking about teaching a course, the anthropology course that I wish I had gotten. I got training in Black Studies and anthropology, and even being trained by Black anthropologists who are wonderful and brilliant, but there was no Zora on our syllabus. We got Malinowski, we got, the sort of classes of anthropology, and, and everyone, we got Marx, we got all that, but there was definitely no Zora, no Catherine Dunham. And I wonder if you had ever taught in the past or seen people teach Catherine Dunham, Pearl Primus, Zora together, as I'm thinking about what it might mean to teach that kind of course, sort of who've been characterized as central to Black anthropology, certainly Black feminist anthropology, but it seems like discipline has them as kind of the stepchildren of anthropology, either because they didn't finish their degrees or because they have this really complicated, but they were really innovating a lot in anthro. And I'll tie that back into the question about you as a creative. A lot of them were innovating how to use their fieldwork in the arts. And so it made sense for us to connect anthropology to literature, to dance, and those things that anthropology seems to have very slowly come to. But they were doing it, like you were saying in your presentation brilliantly, long before any of these concepts came about. So I just wonder about that.
So big question. Let me try and truncate it into several answers. One, I would suggest that you look at the ABA website because there are bios on there of Black anthropologists. And if you look at my book, there's actually a timeline of Black women anthropologists. And I specifically did not make this a third world diaspora person of color book. I was very intentional because I wanted to focus on Black women who had the history of having been native born in this country, so that there was a commonality that we had all grown up under the same regime as part of that. There's also on Medium, there's a column called Representations. It was founded by a white faculty member, but she's working with me and others, in which she is lifting up Black and Indigenous anthropologists that we don't know a lot about. So I would say to you, read Zora, but if you haven't read Faye Harrison, who is highly theoretical, who talks about the persistence of race, but who also is someone who has intentionally included Zora and St. Clair Drake and Du Bois as part of her, her canon of people that she uses. It is good to look to the past, but we also have to look to the moment. And I would say that part of why I founded the Irma McClaurin Black Feminist Archive was because of my frustration of what I was not finding of Zora. And I kept thinking, well, how does this stuff get preserved? Who decides? And basically, archives have been white spaces. They've been places of omission. And what they've done is to focus on the stars. And if you're not a star, they're not interested. So I created my own archive. And the stars will they'll always have space for them. But my intent is to make sure that people who are doing tremendous work now that might not be recognized at this moment, like Zora was not recognized in her time, that work is preserved in total so that someone can go back and look at it and say, wow, look at the amazing work that was being done by someone like Marion McGraham. We know that there's probably stuff that she didn't publish, that still remains to be researched. And so I think it's important to do that. So those are some sources that you can look to. You have Vera Green. Representations is doing a great job, and a lot of the writing there is actually being done by students with faculty editing it. And it's going to be an open source textbook as a kind of complement to traditional text. And then the ABA does they have like bios and stuff of various Black anthropologists on there. And then there are 2 volumes of Afro-American pioneers in Afro-American anthropology, right? The volume 1 and 2 that also has done well researched and is a great resource for people who are seriously interested. And then I'll give a plug for me is that on my YouTube, I have a series called Why Anthropology. They are under 4 minutes, between 2 and 3 minutes, 2 to 4 minutes, in which I've asked Black anthropologists, why anthropology? You know, because they look at us and they say, well, it's this colonial discipline, why anthropology? So I have been collecting those testimonials from people who are in biological anthropology, who are archaeologists, people who work in the Caribbean, people who work in Africa, people who work in the United States. And so that's also a resource. And a friend of mine, a colleague, said, oh, I'm going to show this to my students and maybe have them do their own version of why anthropology. So those hopefully are some helpful resources.
Super helpful. Thank you so much. Thank you.
More questions? I have a bunch of them. I don't want to dominate, but any other questions?
Dr. McClaurin, thank you. Can you talk a little bit more about when you said that ethnography is the method? I know that anthropologists do. I've always tried to figure out like the discipline of ethnography, and then trying to figure that out from the perspective of someone not in anthropology or anything, trying to, could you just talk more about that?
So anthropologists use ethnography in two ways. They use it as a description of methods, so that when we do field work, we're really doing ethnography. Okay, but it's also the product that we produce after the writing up of that research is also called ethnography, right? So in the 1980s, anthropology took a turn towards interpretive anthropology and reflexive anthropology, and people started experimenting with dialogic process in which the ethnography was a dialogue between the researcher. People started challenging this idea of the objective omniscient narrator, basically who the anthropologist was. And so you got a lot of different examples. You got people who were writing novels. There's one called A Twice Told Tale, in which the anthropologist does a straight traditional ethnography, and then in the same book she turns around and then writes it in a different kind of way. You have Ruth Bahar's Translated Woman, in which she's talking about the experience of this Mexican woman, and then the last chapter is called like a biography in the shadow, in which she herself is part of that discussion, right? And she got slammed for that, but that is what people have been doing. And so it is the writing up of the research that is called ethnography, but it is also the description of the method of what we do, the field work, that's also called ethnography.
Thank you.
I'll go ahead and ask my question now. The contrast, this is more historical.
Mm-hmm.
The contrast between, France Boas and anthropology, Robert Park and sociology, Chicago. So that has gotten obviously a lot of attention, a lot of play. And I'm just curious about the relationship between the two, and why do we know so much more about the Park School, as it became to be called, the Park
Right.
School of Sociology, and as opposed to Boas and anthropology? I mean, is this just more racialized? I know that the migration had a lot to do with the emphasis on explaining these burgeoning cities in the 1940s and 30s, and you had to write those stories, and Boas was, Park was at the center of that. But I'm just curious about the relationship between those two, if you have any insights on that.
So you have to understand that anthropologists study people, sociologists study institutions.
Mm-hmm.
And anthropology, when it's separated from sociology, because that really is the parent, right? As a subset, anthropologists took over non-Western so-called primitive people. So the domain of anthropology was really these developing cultures. Mm-hmm. So people studying urban environments and stuff is relatively new in anthropology. That is not what it is. What Boas created in American anthropology, which is distinctive from British sociocultural, and British sociocultural, the biological anthropologists are in the medical school, archaeologists are someplace else. It was Boas at Columbia who created what we now call the four-field discipline. That does not exist in Europe at all, okay? And what it was in relation, Columbia became the site in which they were doing what was called salvage anthropology, which is they wanted to make sure that they captured the information about disappearing cultures, which were the indigenous Native American cultures. So they came at it by biologically, physical anthropology, archaeological, material culture, linguistically. That's why we have the presence of some Native American languages, because anthropologists went in there and documented it. And so that was the domain. Everyone who came out of Columbia pretty much was studying indigenous Native American cultures, right? When Zora went there, she was writing to the Rosenwald Fellowship that she wanted to do something. She wanted to do for the Negro what Boaz had done for the Native American. She wanted to study it from those multiple points, of view. And basically, this is the backstory, is that there's a whole body of correspondence between Boaz and the guy who was directing the Rosenwald Fellowship. They offered Zora a 3-year fellowship, and then they reneged because she wouldn't conform. And the language that they use to describe her is they talk about her as a rough piece of iron that needs to be honed into a fine piece of steel. This is a backstory. This is a subtext that is going on that she has no knowledge of. And these men are making decisions about, I call it containing the genius of Zora Neale Hurston. They want to contain her. They talk about her as a loose cannon, as a rough piece of steel, and that the way they're going to discipline her is to make her follow the Columbia plan. And she writes back and says, I don't understand how studying Pawnee is going to help me in Mississippi, right? And so she basically, she's begging. I mean, the letters are painful because she's literally begging them after 1 year to continue to fund her. They promised and then they reneged on it. And then she just kind of says, okay. She writes them a very nice letter. Thank you so much. This year was very interesting. I went to a lot of plays. And then she goes. She goes into the field to do what she has done, which is to do it on her own. So if you can imagine trying to be an independent Black woman scholar, that's why godmother, it is such a weird relationship. We don't really know all the details. I've looked at the correspondence from godmother. I believe that she was a very sickly woman, because if you look at her handwriting, and her letters are in the Spingarn, when she didn't have them dictated to us from a secretary, they were almost illegible. I think she had some kind of illness or something. And so she sat in this Park Avenue apartment deciding and dictating. And what she forced Zora to do, Zora would write to Langston and say, don't tell godmother I'm talking about this. So she was also playing, performing. People have critiqued her for what she called how much she loved her and stuff, but she had almost no money. And this woman made her account for every penny, including her personal items. She had to document every single penny. And we're just talking a few $100s. We're not talking thousands of dollars, So I think I kind of got off, but sociology was coming up as a way. This is where Du Bois comes in, because he's writing against that school of sociology, which is really where we get the deficit model, where it is a kind of a model of one that pathologizes. Whereas in anthropology, Boaz is trying to make the argument that we need to study the cultures, how they see themselves, as opposed to us imposing our own views. Right. Now, what becomes interesting in Savage Negro, Lee Baker shows that they use Boaz's analysis to bolster the case of Brown versus Board of Education. And he was also writing against racism and trying to say that some of the phenotypic changes, people are talking about the head sizes and this and that. And he's saying some of these things have to do with malnourishment. Some of what you're seeing that you're saying is a innate physical attribute is actually the result of, the cultural conditions, the environment, the health conditions, all of these things. So they were coming from two different places. And the work from the Chicago School of Sociology was feeding into these policies. They were, and anthropologists were really on the fringes because they were studying non-Western people primarily. And it's only in the 1950s or so that you begin to get more studies of urban anthropology, which is still a stepchild in anthropology. You know, people who do archival work like book dissertations and people who do urban anthropology are really not as respected unless you do some great book. They're really not as respected as traditional anthropology. So I started my research doing the life history of a Black woman journalist who committed suicide, Leonida McClain. And I was going to do a life history. That was a method that was being used. The more I read the history of anthropology, I realized that if I wanted to be a card-carrying anthropologist and be able to throw stones from the inside, I had to make some concessions. So I switched my research to beliefs.
Yeah.
My master's was the Leonida, and then I switched to doing field work because that is the coin of the realm in anthropology.
Well, you have given us a lot to think about. I know we're over time, out of time. It's after 5, but I want to thank you from all of us for this rich, intensive, informative. I mean, I've got 2 pages of notes here that I want to follow up on because it was just, I mean, a lot of things were clarified. I mean, this is a perspective that we hope that we would be able to expand in terms of the mini conference, but also to add to our understanding of Hurston. You've done that. So I'm sure we're going to carry over some of these questions as we continue tomorrow. But thank you very much. I'm going to turn it over to Aisha now. And I know a few people have had to step away, but I know we want to wrap up for the day. Thank you all for coming. And Irma, thank you so much again.
Thank you for having me be a part of this. It's my heart's work, so I appreciate it.
Yeah.